Imagine spending 20 years trying to get home. Not 20 years traveling the world by choice, but 20 years desperately trying to return to the people you love, only to be thrown off course again and again by forces beyond your control. 20 years of watching your companions fall, of making impossible choices, of being held captive by those more powerful than you. 20 years of your family wondering if you're even still alive. This was the reality for Odysseus, the Greek hero whose journey home from the Trojan War became one of history's most enduring tales. But here's what makes his story so fascinating. It wasn't just about the physical distance he had to travel. The straight path home from Troy to his island of Ithaca would have taken perhaps 2 weeks of sailing. Instead, it took him a decade of wandering, not because he was lost, but because he was cursed. Today, we're going to explore why the ancient Greeks were so captivated by stories of difficult homecomings, why their greatest heroes struggled not with fighting monsters or winning wars, but with simply getting back to the lives they left behind. And what these stories reveal about how ancient people understood fate, free will, and the invisible forces that shape our lives. Because the Odyssey, it turns out, was never really about the journey at all. Let's begin with a mistake. A single moment of pride that would cost Odysseus everything. After 10 brutal years fighting in the Trojan War, Odysseus and his men were finally heading home. Their ships were loaded with treasure and war prizes, their hearts full of anticipation. Along the way, they stopped at an island seeking food and supplies. What they found instead was a cave filled with cheese and meat, but also inhabited by a creature that would change everything. Polyphemus, a cyclops and son of Poseidon, the god of the sea. The encounter went as badly as you might imagine. The giant trapped Odysseus and his men in the cave, eating 2 warriors at a time like they were nothing more than snacks. But Odysseus, known throughout Greece for his cleverness, devised an escape. He got the Cyclops drunk on wine, then drove a sharpened stake through the creature's single eye, blinding him. When the other Cyclopes came running at Polyphemus's screams, asking who was attacking him, the giant could only shout, "Nobody! Nobody is killing me!" because that was the name Odysseus had given when asked. It was brilliant. As the confused Cyclopes left, Odysseus and his remaining men tied themselves to the bellies of sheep, escaping when the blind giant let his flock out to graze. They reached their ships and began to sail away. They were safe. The plan had worked perfectly. And then Odysseus made his fatal error. Standing on the deck of his ship, still within earshot of the shore, Odysseus couldn't resist. Overcome by pride in his own cleverness, he shouted back to the blinded giant, "If anyone asks who defeated you, tell them it was not nobody. Tell them it was Odysseus, hero of Troy, conqueror of cities." He wanted the credit. He wanted his name attached to this victory. He needed the Cyclops and the world to know exactly who had outwitted him. That single moment of vanity gave Polyphemus what he needed, a name to give his father. And Poseidon, god of the seas, cursed Odysseus to wander the oceans for 10 years, to lose every single one of his men, and to return home alone to find his kingdom in chaos. All because he couldn't stay quiet. All because he valued his reputation more than his safety. The ancient Greeks told this story not as a warning against fighting monsters, but as a meditation on the cost of pride. They understood something we often forget. that sometimes our greatest enemy isn't the obstacle in front of us, but our own need to be recognized. The distance between Odysseus and his home wasn't just measured in miles across the Mediterranean. It was measured in lessons he needed to learn about humility, about restraint, about understanding that not every victory needs to be claimed.
After Odysseus's ships were blown off course by Poseidon's curse, his Odyssey truly began. But if you listen carefully to his story, you'll notice something curious. Many of his delays weren't caused by monsters or storms. They were caused by hospitality. Consider the witch Circe. When Odysseus first arrived at her island, she transformed his men into pigs, yes, but once he proved himself immune to her magic, she didn't try to kill him. Instead, she invited him to stay. She offered food, comfort, companionship. She helped him understand the trials ahead and gave him guidance for his journey. And Odysseus stayed for an entire year. Or consider Calypso, the beautiful goddess who rescued Odysseus after his ship was destroyed. She found him clinging to wreckage, alone and devastated after watching his final companions drown. She nursed him back to health on her immortal island. She offered him something even more tempting than comfort. She offered him eternity. "Become immortal," she said. "Stay with me forever. Never grow old, never die, never face loss again." And Odysseus said no. After 7 years, he still said no. Every night, according to the stories, he would sit on the beach and weep, staring at the horizon toward his distant home. This is the part of the Odyssey that fascinated ancient audiences. Not the monsters or the magic, but this. What is it that pulls us home? What makes a mortal life filled with aging and struggle and inevitable death worth more than immortal paradise? Why would anyone choose certain hardship over offered ease? The answer, the Greeks believed, was about identity. Odysseus couldn't accept immortality with Calypso because he was defined by his roles: husband to Penelope, father to Telemachus, king of Ithaca. To abandon those identities, even for paradise, would be to stop being Odysseus. He would become something else, someone else. The comfort of Calypso's island was actually a form of erasure. This is why the ancient Greeks considered Odysseus's various delays to be trials rather than adventures. Each one tested not his strength or courage, but his understanding of who he was and what mattered. The sirens sang of glory and knowledge. Circe offered transformation and power. Calypso promised eternal youth and love. Each temptation was designed to make him forget why he was traveling in the first place. Home, in the Odyssey, wasn't just a place. It was a state of being yourself, fully and completely, in the role you were meant to play. While Odysseus was wandering the seas, his wife Penelope was fighting her own battle at home. And in many ways, her struggle mirrors his in fascinating ways. Picture Ithaca after 20 years. Odysseus has been gone for a decade fighting in Troy, then another decade trying to return. No one knows if he's alive or dead. His son Telemachus has grown from infant to man without ever meeting his father. And Penelope, as queen of a wealthy kingdom, is expected to remarry. More than 100 suitors have moved into the palace, eating Odysseus's food, drinking his wine, wearing his clothes, pressuring Penelope to choose one of them as the new king. But Penelope refuses. And here's where the story gets interesting.
She uses the same weapon Odysseus uses throughout his travels. She uses cleverness. She tells the suitors she cannot possibly remarry until she finishes weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's elderly father. Every day, she sits at her loom and weaves. The suitors see her progress and wait impatiently. But what they don't see is that every night, once they've all fallen asleep drunk, Penelope sneaks back to her loom and undoes all the work she completed that day. For 3 years, she maintains this deception. 3 years of weaving and unweaving the same threads. 3 years of appearing to move forward while actually standing perfectly still, waiting for her husband to come home.
When the deception is finally discovered, she devises another test. She announces she'll marry whoever can string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads. It seems like a fair competition, but Penelope knows something the suitors don't. Only Odysseus has ever been able to string that particular bow. She's not really holding a contest to choose a new husband. She's creating one final test to prove if the man she's been waiting for will finally return. The ancient Greeks told both stories, Odysseus's and Penelope's, as 2 halves of the same journey. While he was learning to resist external temptations and remember who he was, she was preserving that same identity from a different angle, keeping their home and their life intact for him to return to. Both were fighting against time and pressure to forget or give up. Both used intelligence rather than force. Both understood that faithfulness sometimes looks like stubbornness to outside observers. There's a thread that connects them across the wine-dark sea, the refusal to accept that their story is over just because circumstances make it seem impossible. The Greek word for this kind of loyalty, pistis, doesn't translate cleanly to English. It's faith, but it's also proof, demonstration, something proven through action. Penelope and Odysseus don't just believe in their eventual reunion, they actively construct their lives around it, year after year, even when it seems irrational.
Let's pull back for a moment and consider why Odysseus's journey was so difficult in the first place. Yes, he angered Poseidon, but there's a deeper pattern in Greek mythology about the peculiar burden of being special, of being chosen by the gods for greatness. Consider Odysseus's friend from the Trojan War, Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived. Achilles was nearly invulnerable, his mother having dipped him in the river Styx as an infant to grant him immortality. He could not be harmed by any weapon except for one small spot on his heel where his mother had held him. That single vulnerability, that tiny exception to his invincibility, is what eventually killed him. But here's what's interesting. Achilles knew this would happen. His mother, the goddess Thetis, had given him a choice when he was young. He could live a long, comfortable, unremarkable life and die old and forgotten. Or he could go to Troy, achieve eternal glory, and die young. Achilles chose glory. He chose to be remembered forever over living peacefully. And Greek audiences found this choice both admirable and heartbreaking. Because Achilles spent his time at Troy not in constant battle, but often in his tent, angry and withdrawn, precisely because he knew his time was limited. When his best friend Patroclus was killed, Achilles re-entered the battle not out of duty, but out of grief-driven rage. He killed Hector, Troy's greatest defender, then desecrated his body by dragging it behind his chariot. The man destined for eternal glory behaved at his lowest like a monster. The pattern appears again and again in Greek myth. Heracles, strongest of all mortals, spent his life completing impossible labors, not for glory, but as penance for murders he committed while driven temporarily mad by the goddess Hera. His incredible strength couldn't save his family from his own rage. His greatest achievements were in service of redemption for his greatest failure. Or consider Oedipus, a man who received a prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother. He spent his entire life trying to avoid this fate, running away from the people he thought were his parents, choosing his path carefully, believing his intelligence and caution could outsmart destiny. But every choice he made to avoid the prophecy was actually a step toward fulfilling it. The very act of trying to escape his fate was what brought it about. The ancient Greeks had a word for this kind of divine attention, ate, which roughly translates to ruin or delusion, but really means the confusion and destruction that comes when you're caught up in forces larger than yourself. Being chosen by the gods, being special, being marked for greatness, this wasn't presented as purely positive. It was dangerous. It made you a piece in games you couldn't fully understand, pulled by invisible strings toward destinies you might not want. Odysseus's 10-year journey home was ate in action. His suffering wasn't random. It was divinely orchestrated by Poseidon, but also allowed by Zeus as part of a larger plan to end the age of heroes. Odysseus was special enough to have his story remembered for thousands of years. He was also special enough to suffer more than an ordinary person would have.
There's a character in the story of Troy who deserves more attention. Cassandra, the Trojan princess who could see the future but was cursed so that no one would ever believe her warnings. Her story begins with the god Apollo falling in love with her. To win her affection, Apollo offered her a gift, the power of prophecy, the ability to see what would come to pass. Cassandra accepted the gift, but after receiving it, she rejected Apollo's romantic advances. Furious at being refused after giving such a precious gift, Apollo cursed her. She would still see the future perfectly, but no matter what she said, no one would believe her. No one would even take her seriously. And so Cassandra watched in horror as her brother Paris brought Helen to Troy. She saw exactly what would happen, the 10-year war, the destruction of her city, the deaths of her family. She screamed warnings that everyone dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman. When the Greeks left the wooden horse outside Troy's walls, Cassandra begged her people to burn it, to recognize the trap. The Trojans laughed at her and brought the horse inside. That night, Greek soldiers poured out of the horse, and Troy fell exactly as she had foreseen. But here's what makes Cassandra's curse so terrible. After Troy's fall, she was taken as a captive by Agamemnon, the Greek king. As they traveled to his home in Mycenae, Cassandra had another vision. She saw that Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, was planning to murder him and would kill Cassandra too. She told Agamemnon exactly what would happen. He didn't believe her, and when they arrived in Mycenae, Clytemnestra murdered them both, exactly as prophesied. The ancient Greeks used Cassandra's story to explore something profound about truth and belief. What good is knowing the truth if you can't make anyone listen? What's worse, being ignorant of approaching disaster or seeing it clearly but being powerless to stop it? Cassandra represents the ultimate frustration of seeing patterns others refuse to recognize, of understanding consequences before they arrive, of being proven right in the worst possible way.
Her story also asks uncomfortable questions about why we dismiss warnings. The Trojans didn't disbelieve Cassandra because her predictions were vague or unlikely. They disbelieved her because Apollo's curse made her words sound unconvincing, regardless of their accuracy. This suggests that belief isn't really about evidence or logic. It's about something else, some quality of persuasiveness that exists separate from truth. In the context of Odysseus's story, Cassandra becomes even more interesting. While Odysseus was famous for his clever words, his ability to persuade and deceive, Cassandra possessed perfect knowledge but no persuasive power at all. They're opposites. One could make people believe things that weren't true. The other couldn't make people believe things that were absolutely true. The Greeks understood that having information isn't the same as having wisdom, and having wisdom isn't the same as having influence. Cassandra's tragedy was that she had clarity without agency. She could see the threads of fate, but couldn't pull them in any other direction. She was a prophet trapped in prophecy, watching her own accuracy become a form of torture.
After 20 years away, when Odysseus finally returned to Ithaca disguised as an old beggar, he found over 100 suitors living in his palace, courting his wife, consuming his wealth. And he killed every single one of them, not in battle, not in fair combat, but in what was essentially a massacre. With the help of his son and a few loyal servants, he trapped the suitors in his great hall and slaughtered them with arrows and swords until the floor ran with blood. Ancient Greek audiences didn't see this as excessive. They saw it as necessary. The suitors had violated the sacred laws of hospitality by taking advantage of Odysseus's absence and disrespecting his household. They had pressured and disrespected Penelope. They had consumed wealth that wasn't theirs to take. In the Greek understanding of justice, the severity of Odysseus's response matched the severity of the offense. But here's what's fascinating. The Odyssey doesn't end with the slaughter of the suitors. It ends with Odysseus and Penelope finally reuniting in their bedroom, and Penelope testing him one more time by pretending their bed has been moved, knowing Odysseus built it himself around a living olive tree that couldn't be moved. When Odysseus reacts with the specific knowledge only he would have, Penelope finally accepts that he's really returned. They embrace, and the goddess Athena extends the night, giving them time to share all their stories.
Only after this tender reunion does the epic actually end, not with violence, but with reconciliation. The families of the slain suitors come seeking revenge, but Athena intervenes and establishes peace. The cycle of violence, which could continue indefinitely, is broken by divine intervention. This structure, violence followed by tenderness, followed by enforced peace, reveals how the Greeks thought about revenge. They didn't see it as wrong exactly, but they understood it was endless unless something outside the system stepped in to stop it. Revenge answers violence with violence, which creates new grievances, which demand new revenge. It's mathematical, even predictable. The real question the Odyssey poses isn't whether Odysseus was justified in killing the suitors. It's whether revenge actually accomplishes what we think it does. Odysseus got his revenge, yes. He reclaimed his home and his honor. But the text makes clear that true peace only came when the cycle was deliberately broken, when Athena essentially said, "Enough." Compare this to Agamemnon, whose death we discussed earlier. He sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia to get favorable winds for his fleet to sail to Troy. His wife Clytemnestra never forgave this and murdered him when he returned home.
Their son, Orestes, then killed Clytemnestra to avenge his father. The Furies, ancient goddesses of vengeance, pursued Orestes to punish him for matricide. Only the intervention of Athena and a trial by jury finally broke that cycle. The pattern repeats. Revenge is natural, understandable, even necessary in the Greek worldview. But it doesn't bring resolution. It brings only the next chapter in an endless story of payback. True peace requires something else, some force from outside the conflict, willing to say the accounts are settled, the scales are balanced, the story is done.
When Odysseus finally revealed his identity to Penelope, after all the tests and proofs and delays, they didn't immediately fall into each other's arms. Penelope still doubted. She still needed confirmation. So she tested him with the detail about their marriage bed, the bed Odysseus had built himself around a living olive tree, immovable and unique. Why this test? Why, after 20 years of faithful waiting, would Penelope need proof, even when Odysseus had just slaughtered all the suitors with knowledge and abilities only he possessed? Because the Odyssey understands something profound. Absence changes people. The Odysseus who left for Troy 20 years ago was not the same man who returned. He had seen things, done things, suffered things that transformed him. His hands had blood on them that wasn't there before. His eyes had witnessed horrors and wonders. He had been offered immortality and refused it. He had made choices, some wise and some foolish, that had consequences he'd carry forever. Penelope needed to know not just that he'd returned, but that enough of who he was remained. The bed test wasn't about confirming his identity. It was about confirming that the intimate, private knowledge they shared, the foundation of their marriage built from a living tree, still existed between them.
And this is why the Odyssey has remained so powerful for nearly 3,000 years. It's not really about a sea voyage or defeating monsters. It's about the distance between who we were and who we've become. It's about whether we can find our way back, not just to a place, but to a version of ourselves, to relationships that exist in a specific time and can't simply be picked up where they were left off. Odysseus's physical journey from Troy to Ithaca was about 500 miles. His actual journey, the one that took 10 years, was about learning to be worthy of home again, about understanding what he was returning to and why it mattered, about becoming the kind of person who could resist temptation for something more meaningful. Each trial Odysseus faced, each delay and challenge, forced him to choose between immediate pleasure and distant loyalty. The Lotus Eaters offered forgetfulness. Circe offered transformation. The Sirens offered knowledge. Calypso offered immortality. Each time, Odysseus had to remember why he was traveling. He had to hold in his mind an image of a place and people he hadn't seen in years, might never see again, and choose them over what was directly in front of him. This is what the Greeks meant by nostos, the homecoming. It wasn't just arrival at a destination, it was the completion of a cycle, the return to yourself after being tested and transformed. You couldn't have nostos without having first gone away, been changed, and then actively chosen to return, despite everything pulling you elsewhere.
Near the middle of the Odyssey, Odysseus is hosted by the Phaeacians, wealthy islanders who treat him with great kindness. During a feast, a blind poet named Demodocus sings songs about the Trojan War. And one of the songs he sings is about Odysseus himself, about the wooden horse and the fall of Troy.
Odysseus sits there listening to his own story being told back to him, and he weeps. The other guests notice his tears and wonder why this stranger is so moved by a tale of ancient war. They don't realize they're watching the hero of the story react to hearing his own life transformed into myth. This scene is remarkable because it shows us the Greeks' thinking about storytelling itself. Odysseus is listening to a version of events he lived through personally. But the poet's version, the story version, has already smoothed out complexities, amplified certain moments, created a narrative arc that real life never has. The poet sings of Odysseus's cleverness in devising the wooden horse. He doesn't sing about the men who suffocated inside it, waiting for night to fall. He doesn't sing about Odysseus's doubts or fears, or the sheer luck involved in the plan working.
The story is already different from the lived experience, and Odysseus weeps because he recognizes this gap, this distance between what happened and how it's remembered. He weeps because he knows he's becoming a character in a story rather than a person with a life. His suffering is being transformed into entertainment. His losses are becoming lessons. But here's the interesting part. Odysseus then proceeds to tell his own story to the Phaeacians. He recounts his adventures since leaving Troy. And scholars have long debated whether we should trust Odysseus's account. He's famous for being a liar and trickster. He's telling his story to people he hopes will give him a ship home. He has every incentive to make himself look good, to exaggerate the dangers he faced, to present his choices in the best possible light. The Odyssey seems aware of this. It presents Odysseus's first-person narration without confirming or denying its truth. We hear about the Cyclops and Circe and the Sirens from Odysseus himself, not from an objective narrator. The text invites us to wonder, is this what really happened, or is this the story Odysseus tells about what happened, and is there even a meaningful difference? The ancient Greeks understood that we are all unreliable narrators of our own lives. We emphasize certain events and downplay others. We construct narratives that make our choices seem inevitable or wise. We transform our stumbles into learning experiences and our luck into evidence of divine favor. We are all, in a sense, Odysseus, sitting in the Phaeacian hall, telling the story of our Odyssey in ways that make sense to us, that give meaning to our suffering, that transform random events into purposeful journeys.
The Odyssey concludes with Odysseus home, peace established, the suitors dead, and Penelope satisfied that her husband has truly returned. But there's a larger context to this story that ancient audiences would have known, a context that changes how we understand Odysseus's journey. Zeus, king of the gods, had grown concerned that too many demigods walked the earth. The offspring of divine parents and mortal humans had become too numerous, too powerful. They blurred the lines between gods and mortals in ways that made Zeus uncomfortable. And so he decided to end what the Greeks called the Age of Heroes. He would use the Trojan War to kill off most of these extraordinary beings, to reduce the number of those with divine blood in their veins. The war worked as Zeus intended. Achilles, son of the goddess Thetis, died at Troy. Ajax, grandson of Zeus, died there too. Hector, whose divine lineage connected him to the gods, fell to Achilles' spear. Many others, descended from gods or loved by them, perished in 10 years of brutal combat. But the war alone wasn't sufficient. Zeus needed the journey home to be nearly as deadly as the war itself. And so Poseidon's curse on Odysseus was allowed, even encouraged.
the storms that scattered the Greek fleet, the monsters and witches and impossible choices, all of these served Zeus's larger purpose of thinning the ranks of those special enough to be remembered. Odysseus survived because his story served a different purpose. He represented something Zeus wanted preserved, the idea that cleverness and determination could overcome divine opposition, that mortals, even without divine parentage, could achieve extraordinary things through intelligence rather than strength, that humans didn't need the gods as much as the gods needed to be needed. When Odysseus finally reached Ithaca and reclaimed his kingdom, he marked the transition from the age of heroes to the age of iron, the age of ordinary humans. The Odyssey, then, is the last great story of the Old Age and also the first great story of the new one. It's about a hero, yes, but a hero whose power comes from his humanity, his flaws, his capacity for error and growth and learning. The Greeks understood that ages end not with dramatic finales, but with someone walking through a door they can't walk back through. Odysseus stepping onto Ithaca after 20 years away, Penelope accepting him back into their marriage bed. These quiet domestic moments marked a shift as significant as any war or divine intervention. The world of gods and monsters receding just enough that human choices could start to matter on their own terms. So why do we still tell this story? Why does a tale of a man trying to get home across the Mediterranean nearly 3,000 years ago still resonate today? Part of it is universality. We've all experienced distance from something we loved. We've all struggled to return to a version of ourselves or our lives that seems increasingly distant. We've all faced temptations to give up on difficult journeys and accept easier alternatives. We've all wondered if the people we left behind would still recognize us when we returned, or if we'd changed too much to fit back into our old lives. But I think there's something deeper. The Odyssey is fundamentally about meaning-making. Odysseus faces random disasters, divine curses, impossible choices. His men die through bad luck as much as bad decisions. The universe seems actively hostile to his survival. And yet the story transforms all of this into a purposeful journey, a series of lessons learned, a path toward reunion and redemption. The ancient Greeks knew that life doesn't actually work this way. They knew that sometimes bad things happen for no reason, that the universe isn't testing you, you're just unlucky, that people don't learn lessons from their suffering, they just suffer. They knew this because they lived it. But they told stories like the Odyssey anyway, not as lies about how the world works, but as models for how we might understand our experiences. They were teaching a skill, how to take the random, painful, frustrating events of life and arrange them into narratives that make sense, how to find meaning not because it exists independently, but because we construct it. When Odysseus tells his story to the Phaeacians, he's doing this work. His 10 years of wandering weren't a purposeful journey of learning and growth. They were a curse, random disasters, bad luck compounded by worse luck. But in the telling, they become trials he overcame. The story doesn't change what happened, but it changes what it means. And this is why Penelope's test matters so much. The detail about the marriage bed, built from a living olive tree, isn't just proof of identity, it's proof of shared memory, shared meaning-making.
Penelope and Odysseus together built something from living wood that couldn't be moved, and they both remember this fact. They share a foundation of meaning that survived 20 years of separation. The test confirms that they can still understand each other's stories, still share the language of their life together. The Odyssey, then, isn't just about one man's journey home. It's about how we create homes out of shared narratives, how we become connected to people through the stories we tell together, the meanings we construct cooperatively. How returning home isn't about arriving at a location, but about finding the people who remember the same version of you that you're trying to become again.
The ancient Greeks built entire civilizations around questions the Odyssey explores. What do we owe to family? How do we maintain identity through change? When is cleverness wisdom, and when is it just deception? What makes a life worth living when easier alternatives exist? They didn't expect stories to provide simple answers. The Odyssey doesn't tell us that Odysseus made all the right choices. He didn't. His pride in revealing his name to Polyphemus was foolish and cost him everything. His decision to listen to the sirens, even bound to the mast, was risky and vain. Some of his men died because of his choices, not despite them. But the story also doesn't present these as fatal character flaws that invalidate his journey. They're parts of who Odysseus is. The same qualities that make him heroic also make him dangerous. His cleverness saves his men from the Cyclops and gets them trapped in the first place. His curiosity drives him to explore and leads him into traps. His determination to reach home makes him resilient and also inflexible. The Greeks understood that virtues and vices aren't opposites, but rather extremes of the same qualities. The trick isn't to eliminate your flaws, but to understand them, to know when your strengths become weaknesses. Odysseus learns this slowly, painfully, over 10 years of mistakes and consequences. He learns that sometimes the clever plan is to just sail past, that sometimes curiosity should be suppressed, that sometimes pride should be swallowed. And yet he never stops being himself. He doesn't transform into someone humble and restrained and careful. He arrives home and immediately starts planning how to kill the suitors, devising elaborate strategies, taking risks. He's still Odysseus. He's just Odysseus who has learned when his natural impulses serve him and when they don't. This is perhaps the most sophisticated insight in the entire epic, that wisdom isn't about becoming someone different. It's about becoming more fully yourself, understanding your nature deeply enough to deploy it effectively. The journey doesn't change Odysseus fundamentally. It teaches him how to be Odysseus in ways that don't destroy everything he loves.
As we reach the end of our exploration, I want to return to where we began, that moment when Odysseus revealed his name to the Cyclops, that single act of pride that cost him 10 years. The thing is, Odysseus was right to be proud. He had defeated a monster that had killed many of his men. He had devised a brilliant escape. He had shown courage and cleverness and leadership. Everything he said to Polyphemus was true. He was Odysseus, hero of Troy. He had defeated the Cyclops. He deserved credit. But he valued being known for his victory more than he valued the safety of that quiet escape. He needed witnesses, needed recognition, needed his glory to be connected to his name. And that need, that very human desire to be seen and acknowledged, opened the door to tragedy. The Odyssey asks us to sit with this tension. Odysseus was right and wrong at the same time. His pride was justified and also destructive. He earned his fame and also paid too much for it.
The story doesn't resolve these contradictions because the Greeks didn't believe they could be resolved. They believed human nature contained these paradoxes, that we are simultaneously worthy of pride and endangered by it. 20 years after leaving for Troy, Odysseus finally stepped onto his home island of Ithaca. He disguised himself as an old beggar and walked through his own kingdom, unrecognized. He sat in his own great hall and listened to stories about himself, the legendary Odysseus, whose return everyone had given up hoping for. He was home, but he had to prove it, test it, earn it one more time. And when he finally stood before Penelope, when she tested him with the bed carved from the living olive tree, when he answered with the specific knowledge only he would have, when they finally embraced after 20 years apart, the goddess Athena extended the night so they could tell each other everything that had happened, all the stories, all the sorrows, all the choices and chances and consequences. Because that's what homecoming really means. Not just arriving at a place, but sharing your story with someone who understands it. Not just returning to who you were, but integrating who you've become. Not just ending a journey, but beginning to make sense of it with someone who remembers where you started.
The Greeks knew something we often forget. The long road home isn't measured in distance. It's measured in transformation. It's not about how far you've traveled, but how much you've changed and whether you can still recognize yourself when you arrive. Odysseus spent 10 years fighting in Troy and 10 years trying to get home, but he spent those 20 years becoming the version of himself that could walk back through his own door, reclaim his own life, and pick up the threads of the story he'd left unfinished. The Odyssey wasn't his punishment, it was his education. And every step of it, every trial and temptation and delay, was preparing him to be home in a way that mattered. Because in the end, that's what these ancient stories teach us, that the journey isn't separate from the destination, that distance and time change us in ways that become part of who we are, that we can't step into the same river twice, can't return to the same home we left, can't become the same person we were before we set sail. But we can arrive somewhere new that recognizes our old name. We can build something living that can't be moved. We can find people who remember us and still make space for who we've become. We can tell our stories and be heard, weep for what we've lost, and celebrate what we've kept. We can, after all the wandering and struggling and surviving, finally lay down our weapons and our disguises and our defenses. We can allow ourselves to be known again. We can come home, not to where we were, but to where we are, not to who we were, but to who we've become, not to the life we left behind, but to the life we've earned the right to live. And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, someone will be waiting who has been keeping that life safe for us, weaving and unweaving, holding the space, maintaining the thread that connects who we were to who we might still become. That's the long road home. That's the Odyssey we're all making, whether we know it or not. And the ancient Greeks, who told this story around fires and in halls and in poems passed down through generations, they knew this truth that we keep forgetting. The journey matters, yes, but only because of what we're journeying toward. Only because somewhere, someone is waiting. Only because home, real home, isn't a place at all. It's the story we tell together about where we've been and where we're going and how we found our way back to each other, against all odds, despite all obstacles, through all the long years of waiting and wandering and wondering if we'd ever arrive.